The Fed can't really fight inflation. It can't admit that, so it has to pretend. So it is raising interest rates, but not by enough to do the job.
Before we get into the video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and if you find the video helpful, leave a like.
But ironically, one of the only things the Federal Reserve has accomplished with its rate hikes is its increased costs that businesses absorb and ultimately pass on to the consumer, because all businesses have debt, and now that debt is more expensive to service, and that's just another cost, just like raw materials, just like labor. And so those higher interest costs have to be factored in to consumer prices, and they are helping to push prices higher. So every time the Fed raises interest rates, it's raising costs. It's just like workers getting a raise or raw material prices going up. It is putting upward pressure on consumer prices. The same thing with rents. You're a landlord. You own some apartment buildings. You also have some debt. Your interest costs are going up. How do you recover that? You raise your rents, and your tenant ends up paying the higher interest rates in the form of higher rent. Just like any other costs that are going up, the tenant has to cover those costs for the investment to be worthwhile for the landlord. So the Fed is actually moving further and further away from its goal of fighting inflation. And of course, it's not just consumers that continue to borrow and spend, fueling inflation pressures, but the government continues to do the same thing. In fact, this week, for the first time, the national debt soared past $31 trillion. As I'm recording this podcast, the national debt is already $31,129,000, making a beeline for $32 trillion. In fact, we added the last trillion in about 8 months. I think we could tack on the next trillion in maybe 5 months. One of the reasons that the national debt is growing so rapidly is because the interest cost of servicing that debt is growing exponentially. And so this is really adding to the current budget deficits and compounding the impact on the national debt. And as the U.S. economy weakens, the government is going to see a reduction in its tax revenue. At the same time, it's going to see an increase in its expenditures. This always happens during a recession, and so that increases the national debt, which is the problem when it comes to fighting inflation. Because as the Fed drives the economy deeper into recession with its feigned inflation fight, raising interest rates to fight inflation pushes the economy deeper into recession, which pushes the budget deficits up, but also higher interest rates in and of themselves make the budget deficits higher. And so these bigger budget deficits actually exert inflationary pressures in the economy, because either the government has to borrow the money to finance the deficits from the private sector, crowding out private investment, reducing the supply of goods and services in the economy, pushing up prices, or the Fed has to pivot, monetize those deficits, print even more money, creating even more inflation, and then that demand puts upward pressure on prices. So the Fed is in a situation where it can't fight inflation, because by fighting inflation, it creates recession, which creates even more inflation, because inflation is the only tool the Fed has to get us out of recession. See, what people don't seem to understand is the Fed's solution to every problem has been inflation. Whenever the country has gotten into trouble, whether it's a financial crisis, a recession, COVID-19, the Fed's solution has always been inflation. Well, now that inflation has become the problem, how can the Fed solve the problem of inflation with inflation? It can't. The Fed is out of magic tricks, because inflation is the only trick up its sleeve. The Fed is a one-trick pony. Inflation is all it's got. All it can do is print money, lower interest rates. But now money printing and low interest rates have become the problem. And so now the Fed has no solution.
Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. The Higher Wealth channel is focused on providing the best content we can. And together, we will achieve whatever we dream. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out our latest video.